Welcome, everybody. We're going to be working on Unit 3 today, and I'm just giving you a heads up right now for the students watching this. I may end up tweaking Unit 3 to not include so much content, but for right now, I'm rolling with it. Right now, it's covering 3 chapters, and maybe that was a little ambitious on my part. My main goal for the day here today is to get through Chapter 5 in our book, which talks about creating a JSON API with minimal APIs, which is kind of like a mouthful. But he talks about a lot about how to basically utilize the URL in your app to drive the features of the app from the back end. Now, I have been having issues with the code that he provided in terms of making it run correctly. And so we'll see if we can maybe work through some of that here in class tonight. That's a possibility, but otherwise, it's also a possibility that we're just going to take it as information and just move forward. And it is what it is. If it does, it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And I realize that sometimes people write code examples just for the sake of being code examples rather than actually having them work, which I always find a little problematic when I get a coding book and the code doesn't work, right? So we can be clever though and try to make stuff work, but I don't want to spend my whole time in that space because we're really learning more about the concepts than anything else. So what I do plan on doing here is first pointing out the fact that I have a link to the book code here. I will pull this up on screen. And, YouTubers or whatever, if you guys are pulling the URL, there it is, and I should like have to zoom in and all that to get it. Otherwise, I would just I could probably paste it into the description of the video, right? That's what I should do. All right. So I'll get really smart about my YouTubing and actually help people out. And so we're going to be working in this space. I already have all these files and projects downloaded to my own personal repository, basically in Google Drive attached to this machine. But I will be using this web interface on screen number 2 here. So like, for example, if we're looking at this first one, I might go in there, and I might look at the code file, and you can do that, right? So that's the helpful part of this is you can have it as a reference as you're working. Even though you have the code files, you can download them all and have them on your hard drive. I have those attached to the course, but I'm just showing you how it works. So I have a screen like that open on computer number 2. Now, in terms of where we're going content wise, the basic lay of the chapter goes through these apps basically. So he's got these all pre-built. And then in some cases, we're going to try building it. In other cases, we're just going to try running it. And it's really more about understanding how it works than the actual writing of the code, right? That always can come later. If you get the concepts, that helps significantly in where you're going, right? So that's the lay of the land here. Meanwhile, I'm going to bring us into the PDF version of the book, and I will be bouncing around a little bit. And I don't mean to make you guys dizzy or anything like that with all the yeah, that's not the one I wanted. I wanted this one, right? With all the bouncing around, that's not my goal here. All right. So this is chapter 5. These are the 3 basic topics, and I have some stuff highlighted to start out. And he starts talking, about some of the previous applications that we've done as demos, and yes, they've been super simplistic. But you can also use what he calls, and I want to be really clear on this, what he calls HTTP API. Most people call Web API, but technically Web API is a really kind of its own different thing, right? And so he goes through the whole process of explaining what how he breaks down the chapters, what he's doing in section 2, what he's doing in section 3, section 4, etc. And then kind of moves on from there. So I'm going to go right to section 5.1 here and start talking about, first of all, his definition of an HTTP API, which I think is kind of clever because he recognizes the fact that there is this thing called Web API and it's easily confused. Now, he makes a couple of points here. So I've highlighted some stuff, and there's a lot of highlights at the beginning of the chapter, and then I have not hardly any as I go forward. But he makes the point that regular web apps basically when you hit them through a browser, they return HTML to the browser and you see it, right? You can, he also makes the point that you can easily build applications like that using Razor, which is a language that we use that creates HTML in ASP.NET. We haven't quite gotten to like exploring that yet. We're going to get a little tiny little flavor of it here because we're going to touch Blazor in a second, right? Not to be confused with Razor. And the advantage of this format is, and you'll see it when we get there, is that you set up this template that you're injecting content into, and then that template writes your HTML for you, right? So this is kind of like weird, but you got to set all that stuff up, right? And if you've done, for example, PHP, where you've written backend code that then echoes out HTML, and then you're injecting variables and database stuff into it, you understand what I mean, right? So his point is that this is still a low level basic HTML feature, right? You're basically just getting a response, and what response are you getting back? You're getting HTML, right? That's what's coming back to the browser. The other thing that's kind of happened over time is we've seen the rise of what we call front end development frameworks, and they have a couple of them here listed. And these are ones that we actually teach here at Gate. We have a whole course in React. We used to have one in Angular, but Angular and Vue, these two technologies, I think we typically cover in our web frameworks class, albeit briefly, but to give you an introduction. These are frameworks that are built on top of JavaScript that predominantly operate in the client browser. So in other words, you hit a site, it downloads the application, mostly in the form of JavaScript, CSS, HTML, whatever, but the application is really JavaScript. And then as the application is executing in your browser, instead of it like constantly reloading itself, it's doing data interactions with the server. So if you ask for like, hey, like what are my latest posts on Facebook, it talks to a server, it sends back a JSON response, and then populates the application in the browser. The interesting aspect of that is that most of our mobile apps work exactly the same way, right? Especially ones that are built around HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, with surprise, surprise, a lot of them are, right? So we use all these, web building tools that ultimately become web applications that utilize these technologies. Now, that approach, right, where you have this client-side single-page application, or SPAs, that's an acronym for it, that's become really popular lately, right? So a lot of people build apps that way, and a lot of people deliver mobile apps the same way. And he talks about how it works. He says the server sends this initial JavaScript to the browser. When the user first reaches the app, the user's browser loads the JavaScript, initializes the SPA before loading any application data from the server. And then as you click on things, right? So once it's loaded in the browser, all communication with the server or communication with the server still occurs over HTTP, but instead of sending HTML to the browser, it sends data back to the browser in JSON format. That's become like the ubiquitous transmission medium now, it seems. And then the application in the browser, the SPA, reads it and then generates the HTML based upon what the data shows, right? So like if you're looking for a piece of information, it can pull the information in, and there it is. Right, so that's kind of the lay of the land. Now, this is where the distinction comes in, right? So like some people will call this, basically like the web API piece. And he's saying that sometimes it's called an HTTP API, a JSON API, or a REST API, depending on how it's specifically designed. But he says that a lot of people just refer to it as a web API, which is not correct, but he's going to call it HTTP API in this book, so we understand the distinction, right? So there it goes again. So what is kind of fascinating about all of this, once again, is that tie into the mobile app, right? So like when we go out to, like, let's say the Android Play Store or whatever, and you're downloading an app, we like to think of it as the standalone executable, but the reality is a lot of them are basically glorified web pages, right? And then you're delivering, basically the stuff that you would push into the client, you're delivering it as a standalone piece. And that's why you get so many apps that behave like they're a browser, because, basically that's what's happening. Okay. So I think what's kind of fascinating about this is he demonstrates this concept, right? So let's go back to this little chart that he has to start with. So when you do a regular static web page, the top box applies. So you're on your phone, tablet, desktop, whatever. You send a URL out, it returns the HTML, loads up in your browser, and voila, might have a little CSS, a little JavaScript, but there's your page, right? Static web. What we're working with really falls into kind of our old asynchronous approach, right? So this is an approach that's still heavily used, but a lot of modern developers are moving away from it, by the way, right? And we're kind of tuning into that fact, where we would load part of the page, but then we had stuff on the screen that needed to populate with data from the server. So for example, if I log into Gmail, right, and I need a list of my unread messages, it's not like, writing that HTML on the fly. This part of the page is being populated by the data that comes back from the server that shows me which messages are new, and they're marked bold, but it's an asynchronous request. So part of the page is updated while other parts of the page remain static, right? In the old days, we used to do that mostly with XML, by the way. Now JSON has become kind of the thing, and that's a very normal approach in a REST API format. And the interesting thing about .NET Core is it helps us to actually jump a little higher than that, right? And this is why there is some popularity with doing it like this. When we're using this type of technology, not only can we kind of preload the application and have it ready to exchange data with the server, but it can do a multiple different levels of requests. So for example, when we do a page grab, like in the top example here, that's what we call a GET. And if you guys remember back to your first HTML class, when we talked about GET and POST, when we used to do forms, right? The GET is where we put the URL in the browser, and you can see all the parameters being passed in the URL. Like if you do Google and do a search term and hit enter, we'll look at the URL. Your search term or phrase is embedded in there. That's a GET. It's publicly visible in the URL, and it's meant for just retrieving information, right? Now, if you are ever sending information to a server, think about this. We're doing a request on Google, and we press, the search and press enter, and we're sending it off of GET, but it's bringing information back related to that. So we're sending to the server, and it's bringing stuff back. But here's where the confusion lies, basically. Just because it has a certain verb for HTTP doesn't mean it's incapable of performing other actions. It's just the format in which it sends it. What we're trying to sort of enforce here is that HTTP has a multitude of verbs, and a multitude is maybe not a fair word, several verbs that we typically use. Get and post are probably the most common, but there's also put and patch and delete and a few others that are pretty commonly used in REST applications that have more intent purpose on performing what I'll call CRUD-like operations. Now, if you're not familiar with the acronym of CRUD, which is CRUD, it stands for create, retrieve, update, and destroy, or delete. I always like destroy. It sounds more epic or something. But and then there's verbs basically in the HTTP verbs that match up with those operations. So for like delete, for example, matches delete, and put or post usually is associated with create or creating something new. Update usually goes with patch, and then get is basically just retrieve, right? And all of those are pertinent in any application. If you think about anything that works with data, is going to be performing those actions very regularly. Maybe the least of which is delete, right? But you know, whenever you're sending data back and forth, the point of this is that an asynchronous request is a little bit different than a synchronous or asynchronous request that's at the bottom. And this is the thing I'm trying to provide clarity on, is basically that data can, in the bottom scenario, be live, basically. So like you can be on a platform and content can push out to you without you clicking on something. That's kind of cool, right? Like think about like you're in your email program and then a new message pops in. I didn't click on anything to make that message pop in. It just pushed out from the server, right? So it's like synchronously communicating with the server, or I can click on my inbox icon to see if there's anything new, if it didn't catch the update frequency fast enough. So I'm hoping that gives you a little bit of clarity, but there's different types of things that are happening. But I do want you to notice that when we're working with this synchronous mode here, notice how there's not a laptop, a desktop, and a mobile phone here on the side, right? It assumes something's going on here. What is the something going on? It's your application, right? That kind of stands in the middle of it. Okay. So once again, just to kind of go back to this, I'm going to launch the first app now. And what I'd like you to do is, rather than create this from scratch, I really want you just to load it up. So if you've downloaded the author's code, and so I have here in my folder, here on my Google Drive, I have a copy of all the code files of the book. So once again, you can get that from GitHub if you want. And I'm just going into chapter 5, and I'm going to open up this first project that he has. To open it, I'm going to go ahead and just double click the solution file. It should recognize into Visual Studio and launch it. Now, I just want to give you one word of caution. I'm going to close this right away. You don't have to close yours. I'm just doing it for the sake of example. If you happen to do it the other way around, and I fell into this before, and it happens to me every once in a while, I launch Visual Studio. I'm like, all right, I'm going to open this thing and I'm going to check it out, right? And I made the mistake, instead of opening a project or solution, I open that same folder as a folder, as opposed to, I don't know if you guys caught that, right? Open a local folder is different than opening a project. And I ended up, selecting this folder, and then I get here, and then, and I was, this doesn't look right. None of the icons are the way they should be. And then it says select startup item here. It's not like launching it into the web page. So I can't launch this, because that's my fair warning to you guys. So if you happen to use that new or open interface from Visual Studio, don't choose open a project. Don't choose open a folder. Got to correct that one for sure. Choose open a project, right? Or go to where the project's located in your file system, find the solution file, and just give it a double click, and it'll just open up automatically. Notice the difference in the icons when they come up, though. And I do have like all these resources here kind of opened up and split apart on purpose, because I was exploring this earlier myself, right? So the first thing I kind of want to point out, this is an example of a Blazor web project. And I want to clarify what this means. So they're using a combination of their Razor templating language and using that as the framework to do a single page application. And they have a simple example built into the default. And I don't know if he built this or whatever, but it's a very simple little application that we're going to take a look at. There's still a program.cs file. So if you click on that, you'll notice, okay, there's some stuff in here we haven't seen before. But basically, it is still building an app, using a few key libraries, and then runs it. I want you to notice the difference in the syntax here, right? For running it, but this is the file that drives the whole app to run on a web server, right? However, right, there are up here some additional resources. So for example, you can see all the CSS files, and they're still using Bootstrap and apparently OpenIconic as well. And you know, if you want to look at the CSS, you can just click on the CSS file and you can see all their styling and whatever they're doing. And then they also have some sample data here, which is a JSON file. And I just want you to look at it really quick and notice that the JSON file is just what looks like a date, a temperature, and a summary, right, of weather information. They also have some icons and an index file. So if I click on the index file, you'll see what looks like, heck, a regular web page, right? Notice in the head section of the document, though, how they have a number of different links to some pre-built resources. The one is Bootstrap, right? So Bootstrap is a CSS library we use to kind of accelerate styling. Then there's the custom app CSS. And then there's also the Blazor WebAssembly styles, which are kind of automatically imported because we're using that template. The file itself, you know, basically looks very simplistic. There's not really a lot in it, but what it's telling you is that we're developing a div that's going to load the app. And then if it doesn't load up, look what it says, loading, right? And then we also have an error piece here that would only appear apparently if we're having an error. And then it has a call at the bottom of the HTML. And this is often typical. We want to load the HTML stuff first and then run our JavaScript. The Blazor WebAssembly, which allows that front end framework to work. So this front end framework, once again, similar to like Angular, React, or Vue, or one of those types of things, right, to create a single page app. Then you can go into the pages folder here, and then you can actually look at some Razor code. So for example, here's some Razor code. And how do you know you're looking at Razor code, right? So we'll talk about this later when we get to that chapter. But whenever you see that ampersand, that's an indicator you're dealing with Razor. And you'll see that Razor can be intermingled with regular HTML. So it's not like your HTML skills are like going away, but then you also get like, well, okay, I've never seen that HTML tag before, right? Because it's not really an HTML tag, it's a Razor tag, right? And that's where it gets a little weird, right? So you have some tags that look like HTML tags, but they're not. They're actually Razor tags, and then you have like Razor directives, I think is what they call these. And then it can have a combination of HTML and executable code also in the mix with Razor. So kind of neat. So they have one for counter. They have a fetch data one where it's going to pull in some information from that data file that we looked at. Then they have the index page here, right? Now, what I'm going to do, by the way, is I'm going to go ahead and build and run this. I just want to look at a couple more things before I do that. So they have some layouts here. And the first thing I would look at is this app page here for Razor. And this kind of handles all the traffic, you know, for the application, by the way. Then we also have these shared layouts. So like, in other words, like the layout of what we're going to see is kind of declared here. When there's the little survey prompt that'll come up that we'll take a look at, that's generated by this, but these are the Razor templates for those pieces. And any of these, right? So like if you look at the HTML that sits with that, you know, it's always paired up with the CSS that designs it. So this is kind of like the convention in .NET. It's like, oh, when you want to do this main layout, here's the CSS for the main layout. When you want to do the nav menu, here's the CSS for the nav menu. And it's all kind of attached to each other in locations that are reusable. Because why? Well, the main layout is often used and the navigation is often used, right? So that's why those pieces are there. If you look at the survey prompt, you'll see this is a lot simpler, but still fits into like combination of basic HTML and some Razor stuff as well. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and hit the launch on this, and then let's watch what it does. Goes firing up the web server. It's taking a moment. Notice the loading message. We know where that came from, right? And then here, voila, we have magically kind of like the default Blazor page. And if you kind of click around in here a little bit, right, you'll notice there's an about, right? Well, that takes you over to Microsoft. But then you'll notice that we have a counter, right? And very simple little bit of code here, right? Pretty basic. And then we have a fetch data. And then this one, what it's doing is it's pulling data from that sample data file that's sitting in that one folder. And that's where the stuff is basically coming from. But this is kind of just to show you some of the basic capabilities. You know, one would be, you know, it creates the interface, the navigation. You can do things programmatically, and you can retrieve data at the same time. Now, they also have a little survey put in here, right? And Microsoft really wants you to use this platform. I don't know how many people are going to switch to it, but the conceptions are not that dissimilar from other frameworks like React and Angular and Vue, right? And those are the correlations. All right, so that's kind of the anatomy of one of these apps, and that's all we need to do with this one. So like if you're kind of turning this piece in for an assignment, what I would ask you to do is show it to me running in the browser, a couple screenshots, and then show me that you can access it inside of here. I'm not really concerned which page you like screenshot. I know what the code is. Just give me one screenshot of Visual Studio and give me another screenshot of the thing running in the browser and the fact that you were able to navigate around it. But just to show you that it works. I am going to go ahead and close this one down, and I'm going to jump back over to our textbook. Now, what they're also trying to show us here is, and I'm going to see if I can minimize this bookmark bar here. And I'm not sure if we can really zoom in on that graphic too much, but he's like trying to show us like what files are being called and what the responses are that are happening as we're kind of working through this. Now, if you look really carefully at his browser screen, it shows you which files are being accessed. So in other words, and I don't know if you guys ever do this piece, but you can do this with any browser, right? You can, for example, go into, I'm not sure why they're blocking it here, go into inspect mode. And what he's really demonstrating is there's all these different tools. And a lot of them we, as web developers, you maybe never have used, right? So trying to point out a couple of things. The one that he was demonstrating is the network tool. So anytime, like, for example, you click on something and it's pulling back information, it's showing you what files are being accessed to make that happen. If we were to launch our application and run it, you'll notice that, like, for example, if you clicked on the weather forecast page and it pulled back the data, it would pull back the JSON feed, and you could see that JSON feed right here and see the files that were used in order to pull that down. So that can be a very handy tool, by the way. All right, so that's just a very brief little sideline there. Now, in terms of coming back here and going in the flow of the content, right? The whole idea really is when you click on that application and you ask for that weather forecast, it's not like just kind of magically like reaching out to some weather server, right? It's actually just pulling it from a file that's hard coded. But in principle, if you could get a JSON feed from the weather service, which you can, by the way, you could feed it into your application. So it's not unheard of, for example, if you to write an app and then it detects like where you're located, and then based on that location pulls weather data and says, hey, it's 56 degrees outside, or something to that effect. All right, so I'm gonna kind of zoom out a little bit here. I think just a little bit easier to read. All right. The other little aspect that, you can see some of my highlights here is, how you're feeding in the data, where that data is coming from. Well, that becomes, kind of a later thing, really. But the fact that you can receive the data and then have it update the user interface through the application is pretty cool, right? So I can pull in data and then I can put it on the screen and I can style it any way I want, make it look all pretty, and the world is wonderful, right? Um, but as you're kind of working with this, um, you realize a couple different things, and this is kind of what he's pointing out here. It says that the HTTP API exposes endpoints or URLs that client applications can send and retrieve data from. So the endpoints are used to power the behavior of the client apps, as well as to provide all the data the client apps need to display the correct interface to a user. Now, they do kind of make this thing here, right? That there's so many cool services out there that you can tie into, and there's some engines that you can use for information. And two of the more prevalent ones are the gRPC, that you can do what we call remote procedure calls with, right? Or you can use another really popular tool as of late, which is GraphQL. And he does make a point that he doesn't really cover those technologies in this book, but I know for a fact that a lot of people that are heavy into working with large volumes of data, or like live data from, let's say, maybe you're working with a point of sale system or something, and you're grabbing live data and then you're trying to push it into a website so somebody can analyze it, or into an app. GraphQL is like a very, very common tool to use. And like he says, he doesn't cover it in this book, but both are recommended technologies to study up on. I'd say if I pick one to study before the other, I'd go with GraphQL, because so many people are moving to it and using it these days. Which type of technology you use? Well, it depends on what you're building. Okay, and I gave you a couple of different scenarios, like for example, with weather data. If you want live weather data, well, then you have to tap into a live service, and chances are you would have to use one of these types of technologies. He makes the point here, and he says one selling point for using an API like this is it can serve as a generalized backend for all your client applications. So you can start by building something simple and then add the stuff to it in the aftermath. Now that's kind of an appealing thought. So you could, in that scenario, right, assign somebody to build the interface stuff, and have them work on CSS and all the, the pages and all that stuff. And then you can add in the APIs and the functionality in the aftermath, right? And they could actually do stuff, right? And a very, very common approach for building mobile apps in particular is like interface first, then we build the functional pieces behind it. All right. He goes through a little bit of a talk here, talking about how in part 3, and I'm not sure what part 3 is here, down here, right, in this part of the book. So chapter 13 and beyond, he talks about Razor Pages and building complete applications with it. So we'll see how that goes when we get to it. And whether you choose Razor to do it or you use a different framework, that's all on you, right? If you're working for a company, chances are they've already chosen an approach. A lot of people who are using front-end frameworks like that that are already in place, there's a good majority of them are using Angular. I think people who are doing new incorporations of the technology tend to opt for React or Vue these days. I don't see a lot of people using Blazor, but Microsoft's going to push it for sure. And then you do have a fair amount of people that are using Razor as well. And then the other important aspect of this is, or an intermingling of some of these technologies. Usually you choose one framework over the other, but it's not impossible, for example, to take some Razor techniques and pepper it into like the other stuff that you're doing. There are, of course, books that they're trying to sell you on, right, from the same publisher, talking about all those particular aspects. All right, now we're going to shift gears a little bit here And we're going to start talking about like some of the stuff that we've done, and we've already experimented, for example, with really simplistic little things like this. So for example, um, if we do like, the basic verb of get, um, and we declare the root URL and we put up a hello world or whatever it does, or we add the capability of responding to this URL, right? Append that to the end, and it works with some sort of an object or a function or whatever. We got those to work, right? Not a big deal. But he's kind of pushing us to this example. He goes, what might be more useful is to use an API which you can provide the user's first name, and the API returns all the users with that name, right? And what becomes kind of neat about this is you can actually start to, for example, build URLs where not only are you calling, something that's been pre-routed, but you're calling actual functions or applications or middleware by name, and then throwing parameters at the middleware too to execute tasks. All right. So what I'd like to do, and I'm not going to build this one, and on this one, I want you guys to do the same thing that I'm doing, which is just to open it and run it. Right. So this is my recommendation. I just want to see that you can get it to work. So the one that we're going to open now is the basic routing minimal API app. So I'm just going to open up the solution file here. And yeah, I could go through the mechanics of mechanically typing it out, right? That's certainly a doable thing. I'm opting not to, right? Just to be clear on that. All right, so they start by mapping all of this out in terms of some really basic code. So let's talk about like what code they're throwing in here that is kind of maybe new to us in the C# world. So the first thing that I'm noticing, I'm looking at the very bottom instead of the top here, is he creates this data structure called a record, which is basically a type of collection. And you can kind of sort of, I guess, think of it as I'm trying to think of like a correlation here to a different language, but I'm not like landing one quickly in my brain. But basically, it's kind of like an object that has multiple data properties. But as it kind of implies here, it's not a complex object. There's not methods traveling with it. It's just a collection of data, right? So it's a record, I guess is the way to look at it. But each person record contains two data fields, basically a string and a string for first name and last name. And then up here, what I've done is, not what I've done, what the author did is he created this basically new list of person records, right? That is really the correct way to say it. So a list is kind of like an array that can hold multiple values. And then we're populating the array with another complex data object called a record, right? Which is, think of it as more of like a object or a class without functions, basically. We're naming that structure people. And notice the naming convention, they start with an underscore on it, right? And then they instantiate several different, movie star people here into the record. When you look at the other parts of the application here, you'll notice that they have a get in here. So there's an app map get. And notice it doesn't map the root URL. So when I run this, it's not going to land on a page, right? But it is going to be running the application. And then it's kind of an interesting thing here, because this is in the form of what we call a lambda expression. And notice as I hover over it, it says that whenever you see that equal sign with a greater than, which is like a pointer, basically what this means is it's going to take the name that you append to the URL. It's going to read that in as a variable called name, which is a string, hopefully. And then it's going to run this code. And if you really kind of look at this, this is kind of in the format of almost a query, right? You know, the keyword where, right? And what it's doing is it's taking and it's looking at one of the person objects, looking at the first name that starts with the name, and it's doing like running a comparison, and it's ignoring case, right? So in other words, if I run the application and type in Tom, it should return Tom Hanks. You know, that's kind of the thinking here. So let's run it and just prove that it works. So here's the run. And as predicted, right, it's doing nothing in the browser because I don't have the root URL mapped to anything. So when it launches and you hit the root URL, this is what you get. Sorry. However, if I append to the URL, and I'm just kind of moving this aside so you can see this person and then a name, right? And the format in which it is, this is just a string. And this is basically string interpolation inside of C#, right? And string interpolation is, it's like a placeholder for a variable. We're injecting something in there. So I'm going to append to the URL here, person / and then, for example, if I type my name, comes back with an empty result set. Is this an error? No, this is not an error. It's returning JSON is what it's doing. And JSON is always started and ended with square brackets, and there's no return result, right? So this is not wrong. This is actually correct, right? So it's a blank page. Now, if I change that URL and I type in Tom, and notice I'm intentionally typing a lowercase t here and press enter, now it's reaching into this list of person records and finding Tom in the first name, right? Ignoring the case, and then pulling back the entire JSON object that goes with it, which is the key value pair, first name, last name, right, of Tom Hanks, right? If I change this and I type AL for Al Pacino, there's your Al Pacino, right? And what I should probably do, and I don't know if there's any here where there's a 2-letter sequence that repeats. You guys see any 2-letter sequences that repeat here? I don't see any, right? Which is unfortunate. And I'm looking in the first names, right? So like if there was a, yeah, I don't see any that repeat, like even the 2-letter sequence, you know, where it's kind of like, you know, but let's try one more. So let's do Leonardo, right? Did I spell that correct? No, I did not, right? Okay, so he's got a typo. Check this out. Leonardo DiCaprio. All right, I do have to laugh. So code is very particular, right? There you go. So if I type in it incorrectly, it does come back. And I don't know if that was an intentional thing on his part or not. But all right, I'm going to pause the video here one more time just to see. All right, seems like everybody's got this thing working. So make sure that you do screenshot a couple of examples, and then also screenshot like the code on the program CS file, just so I know that you guys got that far and made it work. Now I'm going to go ahead and close the browser here. I want to talk about a couple of his little notes that he has, right? Because sometimes he has some pretty useful comments in here. And he says, note that this is for demonstration only. Using a list is not thread safe and should not be used in practice, right? So in other words, this could in principle be hacked, right? So like if you're trying to obscure this data from somebody, this is not the way to do it. Right, and it says, notice like what the recommended practice is, use a database. Why a database? Because the database is on the server in a location where the users cannot query it directly, right? Or go get all the information. Or some other type of data structure that is thread safe and isn't going to be intercepted. So that could be in a number of different formats, by the way. I'm going to go ahead and close this app down. All right, so that's kind of an example then of using, you know, basically your application, and I'm looking at this little snippet here, right? where really the person thing, this is a routing thing, right? So when it looks at the app, it finds that, but notice that it's also looking for a parameter. So the route, in the way he says it, the route is parameterized. Mouthful, but correct. So we're calling basically a route, in person, and then we're adding a parameter of the name, and then that executes basically, this is what I call an unnamed function, basically, right? So this is a function that it just executes. It doesn't it's anonymous, right? So it's anonymous function. It's just code that executes a very, very simple function um, with its own Lambda expression that basically executes this code, right? And what's kind of neat about that is you can set up these routes to kind of just run a little snippet of code without having to actually write a whole function on it, or you can write a function, whatever. But sometimes if the action's really quick and simple, you don't have to go that deep on it. So they give a couple examples here, the same one that we did, right? And this is what it should be returning. And, you know, and it says by default, minimal APIs serialize C# objects to JSON. That's kind of like a normal convention in this technology. All right, I think what we're going to do next is we're going to take a break because we're about halfway through already, believe it or not. And then we'll come back in about 5 minutes. So I'm going to pause the video here. All right, we're back from our break and moving on to the next section here. And now, one of the points that they make here is that, so far we basically only played with the get feature of HTTP. It does make the point that get is the most used verb on the web, right? So whenever you type anything into a URL in the browser, it's always in the form of a get because you're trying to get information into your browser. But if you're ever sending information to a server, or, using it to update database information or whatever, right? You should never, ever use get. Instead, you should use something like post or delete, right? Which match up with the CRUD operations once again. Now it doesn't say that you can't, and I want you to understand this. It doesn't say you can't use get. It's just not a good idea. Just to kind of give you like a really bizarre mindset. In the old days of Yahoo, you used to go to their website and you'd sign into your account, and they had this option where you could just sign in with HTTP. In other words, not secure, and send your username and password through a get, and your password would actually be in the URL. And then later on, they were like, or sign in securely with HTTPS, where they would use the post verb to obscure it in transit. But the reality was it wasn't actually really encrypted, and it was still interceptable, right? So very, very bad security schemes never happen these days. But just to give you that idea that that's possible. Now, what's kind of interesting about this is if you want to take a look at some of this stuff, information that they're talking about, and how the web works, and they talk about HTTP and how HTTP functions. You guys want to read up on this? Please do, right? There's kind of like this thought here when we work with HTTP that everybody just kind of knows it, and that's not really the case. In fact, I would say that you don't really latch your mind to like how this actually works as a protocol until you kind of get a little bit more advanced and read up on it and go, oh yeah, that makes sense. It's kind of like one of those types of things. So highly recommended reading right here that he links to. They do a very nice job of talking about how HTTP works, what protocols are used, right? So you can see HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and web APIs all operate basically inside the browser, right? They're transported by HTTP, and then there's all these other network technologies that sit above it. This is basically kind of like the network stack or the OCI stack, and all the web applications sit on top, right? The software layer, this is the transport layer, and then these are the mechanisms underneath, right? So that's kind of a very quick little review of that. Now he does talk about the fact that like you do have these other verbs that you can use. I'm trying to get this table up on the screen here. So get up at the top, most common, post to send information. When you guys learned how to do HTML forms, if you took the class with me, I'm not sure how others teach this, but I always make that explanation between get and post, right? Like whenever you do a form, it's really a good idea to post so somebody can't walk along and see what's in the URL and steal your password or whatever, you know. Then there's also put, which is kind of like a way to that one's real frankly not used a lot, but it can be used to kind of update information is a way to think of it. But then again, so is patch, right? So these two are often used for changing things. Delete, of course, is as it sounds like if you're trying to connect to a database and delete something, you really ideally should use that verb. And then you can also do the possibility of using like this methods where you have a number of them that you're calling at the same time. So like one click could trigger many operations to happen. At, you know, add a user, delete some data, update this data. You know, one action could conceivably do that. But the key ones, right? So get, post, put, delete, and patch, and then combinations of those. The other thing that's kind of weird is you can also define custom ones. That gets even weirder. But he does make a little note here that you don't see them implemented consistently. This is one problem with them, right? So people use them in different ways, don't necessarily use the same ones for the same purposes. But the recommendation is to stick to what's in this table and you're usually okay, right? Microsoft does the same thing. I think he stole this right from Microsoft, and we'll see that in just a little bit. It does talk about this whole concept of RESTful applications really lean on that pretty heavily. The next little thing that we're going to do here, and I'm going to go ahead and download this app and install it, or at least show you where, because I've already done it. And I have a link in our unit folder for this, but there's this app out there called Postman. I'm going to go ahead and click through to it. And what I would recommend, right, like if you end up on this website, and of course, I'm going right to the tool, whereas if you guys are going there, I'm going to go ahead and sign in. And I never set up a password. I just signed in with a Google account, which is what I suggest you guys do. If you come into the site cold, you don't immediately get hassled with doing that. Now, you will notice I am already like kind of into the tool, and really what would probably be better is, let me just bring up a neutral browser here. And I'm going to go to postman.com. So you see what the page, this is what it looks like if you're not signed in. All right. So this is what I'm trying to push you to. And what I just want you to do is go to product, right? Go to download. Most of us are probably going to be Windows, but there are Mac versions too, right? Download and install the software. And then somewhere along the way, you will get prompted when you go to run the installer. Do you just want to use the lightweight version for now? Which is what I recommend. So just say yes to the lightweight version. And you can see I'm not demonstrating it because I already have it going. All right. Now, in terms of running this, I do have it loaded up as an app here. But what you'll notice is that you can also operate through the browser too, right? But just, I'm going to bring this tool up and I'm going to show you. I was playing with it a little bit earlier, but basically what this tool does is the following. It allows you to run an application such as the one that we're building, where we're going to be running this web-based application. We're going to try to trigger its URLs with parameters and then send and receive data. But we're not building a full-blown website with screens to pump the data into. What we're doing here is going to run the app, we're going to send in the URL that we're trying to run, and we're going to see what the server response is. Did it work? Did it send data back? Did it give an error message? What is the error message? Right? That's what this tool is for. Now, this is not a tool I've used before, so I find this one particularly fascinating, and this is what I love about IT folks. By the way, is I always find these cool new tools. I'm like, oh wow, this could be very useful, right? This is one of those tools, it seems, right? So all right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open up the next application. So in other words, let's see, where are my, so I was looking at his, yeah, chapter 5 fixes, which weren't very helpful, by the way. We're going to be working on the multiple verb minimal API next, I think is where we're going to. So I'm going to go back to the book content here as soon as I can find it. I'll read up to that point and we'll run it. We'll use that Postman tool to kind of help us out a little bit. All right. So they give us this example, like for like the thing that we just did when we were running it. And maybe we should run it and test it with that, you know, that's actually a good thought. Is we're sending in this URL, we're sending in a name, it finds it in the list and it returns a response. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. And I want you guys to kind of follow along with me if you can. I'm going to bring up that basic routing app again. So the one that we just had opened up. I'm going to go ahead and launch it. We know that it'll launch to a blank page, right? We've already gone through this. And then, for example, I'll type, you know, like this person Leonardo, but we know he misspelled it. So Leonardo, I don't know if that he's trying to slam the guy on purpose or something. I'm not even going to say what I'm thinking, right? But there you go. So you see the response, and this is what's happening in the browser, right? Now, this is not an HTML response. This is just a straight up data response. All right. So now I'm going to, with the app still running, you notice that, you know, it's still running up here. I can see the things spinning in the background there. I'm going to leave the browser and I'm going to go over to Postman now. And I want you to notice here in the URL though, for example, the port changed since the last time I ran it. So it's on port 7103 right now. So I'm gonna actually just copy this URL. I'm going to switch my verb to get, right? That's the default. And then I'm going to paste in the URL, right? And then I'm going to hit send. Right? And then it returns, and now notice what it did is it returned the HTTP message 200, okay. So that's a good one, right? It means, hey, it worked, you're good. Right? You got your response. What is the response? Well, I can see it. It's a JSON file, or it's JSON data here in its raw format. Well, this is pretty, right? This is actually what it sent back. The same thing that we saw in the browser. Pretty is just formatted and indented, right? But the point of this tool is that we can then test, you know, the browser to see, hey, does it work, right? So for example, if I switch my verb to post and send it, notice it says method not allowed, right? And the reason for this is back in the app itself, if I was to look at the, you know, the setup here, I don't have anything set up for map post. I only have something set up for map get, right? So that's kind of the point of it. All right. So I'm going to go ahead now and close this application. I'm going to leave Postman open and I'm going to open up the next application. So I'm going to go back to our repository. We're going to open up this one, the multiple verb minimal API thing. And so I'm going to open that up directly in Visual Studio, open a project or solution, multiple verb. I'm going to go in there, find the solution file and go ahead and open it. All right. So here's the code file. You can tell I was looking at it a little bit earlier. And this now matches up with the content in the book. So he goes through and he talks about the lay of the land here. So in other words, Um, we can set up actions within our app like we did for like different URL points, right? So like we can have something for the root. You notice this one doesn't have anything for the root, right? And what he's doing, and we should probably look at an anatomy of all of what he's doing, but he's setting up like some records for fruit. He's handling things to handle fruit. So like to replace, to add fruit, to remove fruit. And then I want you to notice the verbs that go with. So if I just want to get a listing back, right, um, from fruit, what this is going to do is it's going to do a lambda function. Notice it's not named, right? So this is why we call it anonymous. And then it's going to trigger this. Notice the capital F in fruit, and all, and then it would come down here and it would find fruit all, right? And then it would output all the fruit, right? You know, that's kind of the thinking here. You can also do something that's even weirder, right? Is you can take that whole thing. So basically, instead of you know, just having it grab all the fruit, I can specify a particular ID. So if I have an ID attributed to a piece of fruit, and then it will go to that fruit object, if you will, and pull back that information. But this whole function and lambda expression gets stored in a variable. So then when I go to use it, it's kind of doing all of this right here. It's kind of a neat thought, right? So in other words, if I have an apple and I give it the ID number of A1, I could type fruit slash A1 and get apple back on the screen, right? Assuming I have apple created to begin with, right? The other thing that they have, kind of interesting here. So, all right, let's back up a second here. So, whenever you see this type of expression, right, in code, and this is true in Java, by the way, too. So this should resonate with you, Java people. That's called the lambda expression, right? The other thing that they're doing here is they're going past the get. So these two are both gets. One just brings back everything. One brings back specific information. And then the next one is a post, which is sending information to the server. And then it triggers basically a different function. So it's like, it's looking up the fruit with the ID, and then it is triggering this handlers add fruit function, which is, well, the handlers is a class, add fruit, which is down here, is a method, right? That's looking for an ID in a fruit. And then it, in principle, adds it to the fruit object or fruit record, so to speak. Now, when I played with this earlier, I could not get it to add fruit no matter what the heck I did. And I don't know if it's just an error in his code. So maybe if we put all our eyes together and look at this, maybe we'll find a solution. But maybe it's just code that was written as an example and never intended to work. That's my other suspicion, right? And so like authors sometimes do that in books like this. All right, so that's the post one. Then there's another one, right? So where you can take the handlers and name it as a variable, and notice they're just creating new handlers. And in this case, they're doing a put, which would trigger the replace fruit. So in other words, if I threw in an ID and I wanted to change an apple to a Macintosh apple, I could do that, right? To replace it. Then there's also the delete, and then that completes all the CRUD operations, right? So retrieve, update, create, destroy, all that stuff is all done in there. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and launch this one. I'm going to leave Postman open. I want you to show you like maybe like this time it'll be like magic time and it will actually work, right? But I was not able to get it to work earlier. So let's launch it. It should launch to a blank page. It's not broken. It is using the server address of 7289. And here's what I'm gonna do. I'm just gonna copy this, by the way, right? And then I'll come back over to Postman here and then I'm gonna paste that in. Now, the one thing I'm finding really kind of interesting here is that it's pushing this all out to HTTPS, right? Because that's the way he built his app, right? Um, and I'm wondering if that might be part of the reason why some of this is failing. Like if I build it without HTTPS, would that work? So you know what? I'm going to experiment with that as soon as I'm done with this. You know that, and I think that's a pretty logical thing. So let's send just the root URL. Let's send it as a get and see what it generates. So we're going to send, and what's our error message? It says 404 not found. Is that correct? Well, yes, because if you look at the setup of our app, we have nothing in here that responds to the root URL. We can fix that, right? So here's something you could experiment with, is you could do a app map get, right? We can assign it to the root URL, right? Like we've been doing. And then how do we do a hello world? I just type hello world. Yeah, I have to actually double check the syntax on that because I'm not really frankly sure, but like he has it right here because he was making fun of it basically, right? And so we do an empty lambda expression and say hello world. So let's do that. So empty lambda, so unnamed function, there's the lambda operator, and then we're just going to do oh, what are we going to do? Hello, whatever, semicolon at the end. So let's go ahead and stop the application from running, relaunch it. All right. Now as it launches, it does go to the root URL. Now, if I go back to Postman and now do a send on it, it is giving me a 200 OK. Right, because it's actually reaching that endpoint. Okay. So now this is where it gets interesting. Now, the other ones we're going to start experimenting with, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to move some of these windows out of the way so we can kind of see what it's supposed to be doing, and then watch it actually happening inside of Postman, right, and see what response we get. So the next one to test would be to add fruit to the URL. So let's do it, FRUIT, and I'm going to press enter and hit send, and now I got a response. Okay, I'm looking at the response that I have, and it is what? It's empty. Is that okay? All right. Jonathan, I see you shaking your head. Why is that not okay?
Don't we want to add more to that, like add like a fruit to the end of it?
Well, if we have one to add, but what fruit do we have right now?
We have nothing right now.
We have nothing right now. So is the response correct?
Well, I guess it is correct because it is returning the JSON, an empty JSON object. It's going through.
All right. So this being the case, right? It says it's okay. It's that it's talking to the server and it's coming back with a response. So it's not saying it is wrong. And okay, fair enough. I think that it is the correct response. Now, if I wanted to add a fruit, this is where it gets a little weird, right? So according to this format, and this is where I kind of got stuck, right? Because this would be triggering a static method. This is how I would add fruit. What this is telling me is that I would add an ID and then a string to add fruit, or is that where it's being triggered from? So I would have to come down here and I would look, right? Yeah, this is just taking an ID and a fruit object is what it really is, right? And then adding that to our, I guess, record of fruit. All right. So this is where I got stuck. So let's see if you guys can help me work through it. So now to do this, it has to be a post. Right, so we're changing our verb to post. And then I'm appending fruit to the end of it. Let's just try it like this. I'm going to hit send on this, and it says method not allowed. Okay. But I didn't send, for example, I didn't send like an ID number. So like one of the examples, if you look really close to the author's stuff, he did like F1 for like fruit one, lowercase. But if I want to send parameters, how do you send parameters? And this is where we get a little bit weird here, because if I just send this, this gives me a bad request that it's not, you know, fully formed is what it's telling me. And then if I did something like intuitive, like if I just do a ID number, comma, the name of something like Apple, that also doesn't work. Now I tried a whole bunch of different things, and being, you know, somewhat clever about this, by, you know, by the way, at least I think I'm kind of clever about this, is it's a matter of how I'm posting the stuff in here. Because typically when you do a post, you usually call the function. I don't know which function to call here, real frankly. But I'm guessing it might be add fruit, right? And then you do a question mark. And then you say ID equals, well, I'm just going to try this, F1, comma, and then the fruit, which is in my mind an apple, right? And I hit send, and that's not working either, right? And I tried a whole bunch of different little approaches here, but I was not able to ultimately land on the right URL to trigger it to actually create an object. And I'm not sure if HTTPS is to blame, but I have that suspicion, right? Like, because where is this writing to? This is the thought, right? It's writing to the memory of the browser that's currently running. That's what's happening. His app is built with HTTPS. I haven't approved the HTTPS server to write to my hard drive. Yeah. Okay, so here's my goofy thought here. I'm going to take all of this code. I'm going to rebuild this app.
I got a question really quick.
Yes.
When we go back to Postman or Post, is that what it's called? Postman? Yeah. When we add that, when you have that there, the add, when you call that function fruit question mark ID equals F1, you have your keys there. If and it's putting that whole expression into ID. Is there a way that to, I guess, add another key to that?
Yeah, you know, I'm not sure quite the answer on that, real frankly,
Yeah.
Jonathan.
Does it maybe have to be two separate functions called in the same?
Yeah, you know, he doesn't have a clear example of showing it working, so I don't
Yeah.
know where to draw from, real frankly. I have this suspicion though that if I was working in non-HTTPS mode, it might actually write back to the browser.
Oh, okay.
That's kind of my thinking here.
Sure.
So if you can humor me for a second, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, okay, so I've copied all this code. I'm going to close this solution. It's no longer running, by the way. Make a new project. It's going to be empty. We'll say next. We'll call it test. I don't know what this is, 5.2.2 or something like that, or 2.3 maybe. Uncheck HTTPS. Go ahead and let it create. Or that. Come here, I'm going to replace all the code. I don't have any errors that I can see, which is a good thing. So let's go ahead and just save this. let's go ahead and launch. Right, so new port address here, 5137. So back in Postman, we're going to just change this to 5137. We're also going to get rid of the S. And I'm just going to try a simple get to begin with, just to see what happens if I call fruit. Okay. Okay, so this is working, right? Now let's try switching it to post and see if we can get it to trigger. And once again, I'm not sure of the correct format of the URL here. So for example, if I type in, can I do something as simple as F1? Right. I don't think it likes the format of how I'm sending it in. So here's, let's do this for a moment. Let's pause for a second and maybe we can put our heads together and figure this out. All right, if, the bottom line of this is, and I think we're discovering, is that the way that this is engineered right now, at least, we're either not figuring out how to send the stuff in, or we're not doing it in the right format, or it's not actually designed to work. And I'm kind of leaning more and more towards it's not designed to work right now. And he ends up going into this next little section here. I'm trying to get back down to it, right? So the next section in here is getting, results basically. So like if you had a piece of fruit, and it's not there, you're going to get like responses basically that, hey, this isn't there. And the other thing that he also kind of tries to mention is that regardless of which of these techniques you use, you could use many of them to make it do what you want to do. It's just a matter of how you're designing your app ultimately. All right. He does go into this thing where he's kind of breaking it down a little bit more here, right? And gives you a breakdown out of all the different responses that you might get and why you're getting that response. And then he's ramping up the code on top of it all. Right. And what responses you should get, like, like a 204 for like either not finding something or actually after deleting something because you're not finding it. And I'm tempted to try this one too and see how it operates. But I think we're going to run into a roadblock after roadblock, honestly, getting them to work, because I've tried this before and it did not have a lot of response. He gets into returning useful errors here, so you can actually tell it which error codes to push back, or design custom messages to inject back to the browser. So like if you're looking for a certain fruit, and I don't know if you guys can really make that out here, but let me expand a little bit, but like he's calling fruit 2 and it doesn't exist, and then it's coming back with a custom error message this time as opposed to nothing, right? So what I would like to see from you guys ultimately is the following. With each one of these apps that they have in the chapter, I want you to attempt to run them. And I'm just going to do these really, really quickly here. And I'm going to go to, I think, this one and launch it. And once again, I'm going to be monitoring on Postman. We'll probably get a different port number each time, by the way, right? But that's okay. We'll let this launch. All right, 7289 is back again. Back over to Postman to test it. And notice it keeps a record of the ones that you've done. So I'm going to just go back to one that I know works, like this one, right? And I'm going to send it again to see if it works. Okay, it's working. And then I have, well, I can just type to append here. If I'm pulling back fruit 1, should send back an error, but now you're seeing it's giving me a response, right? Because he's got the response built in. That's kind of the thought. Now, if I go to post and try to send that, it's still not liking it because it's not mapped out, right? And I think that he kind of just keeps building on it. All right, so here's what I'm going to have us do, and I don't want to get too much deeper into his what I feel are kind of like errant lecture materials or whatever. But he talks about basically custom designing pipelines for dealing with these issues, and eventually gets to the point where he's either pushing the status codes or returning file pieces, right, as we need them. He also has a bunch of filters that he throws in. And then ultimately, and I'm trying to get to the routing part here, which I think is where the answer lies. Um, do you use filters or do you use middleware? And then ultimately, I think he gets to routes, which seem to be a better solution. So, and you see, I'm scrolling, and he ends up with this. And I think this is the piece that we're kind of missing, right? So, like, we're looking for parameter lists, right? You notice gets work with fruit or the fruit ID, post would work with the fruit and the ID. So this is more of like what we're thinking, and that's not the app that is really designed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the last app he has and see if that one works, and then we're going to switch over to the Microsoft tutorial, which I think is going to become our primary assignment, by the way, for the chapter. And it looks like we'll probably have to code through most of it next time, but we'll get started tonight. So I'll go ahead now and I'm going to close whatever I have open inside here. I'll close the solution. I'm going to go to the end of the chapter basically, and open up this project, and let's see how this one works. I kind of have this thought that this one might be the magic sauce, right? He's kind of building up to it. So he's got all this stuff built in. There's some stuff in here that the engine's not really digging, but I think it'll do now what we expect it to do with all of this code. All right. So your challenge on this one is just to get this to run, as is mine. All right. So letting it launch, right? Blank page is okay. We're still on port 7289. And then here, I'm going to go ahead and test. I'm going to test fruit with a get. Let's see if we get a response, at least on the things that we know should work. We're okay there. Let's add a F1. That should error out because it's not found. Let's go to post and then see if we can do F1, comma, whatever. I don't know if this format will work, but I'm testing it. Doesn't like it. Or if it would be in the form of a multiple URL like F1/Apple. Right. It's still not working. I'm not sure if you guys can get this to work, but right now, I just at least want you to try all of these and do what I'm doing right now, which is to test them, see what responses you get. Maybe somebody will figure out the secret sauce for sending the data in, and then we'll talk about it in the aftermath and laugh. Right? All right. So for right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cancel this video. This video is going to end here, and then I'm going to create a new video talking about the tutorial, and I'm going to get us started on the tutorial, which we'll finish next time. Right. All right. So I'm going to hit stop record button here if I can. Thank you, Zoom, for making it so difficult.